Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're exploring a massive contradiction that's been hiding right in plain sight. When you think about 1980s UK music, you probably picture fierce rebellions, right? Underground artists, a gritty counterculture just raging against the political establishment. But what if I told you that this rebellious anti-capitalist indie music scene was actually the absolute perfect embodiment of 1980s free market capitalism? Sounds crazy, I know. Today, we're going to break down the indie paradox, music, money, and the 1980s. Okay, let's dive into this. It's pretty much universally accepted that the 1980s independent music scene was bitterly opposed to Margaret Thatcher's conservative government. Just listen to the words of Johnny Marr, the legendary guitarist for the Smiths. He said, "It was a given that you were political. You were either mainstream or you were anti the government." And honestly, that was the dominant narrative back then. Indie music acting as this collective, democratic resistance against corporate and government power. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how historical accounts completely disrupt that popular narrative we just talked about. Take Penny Rimbaud, a core member of the fiercely anarchist punk band Crass. He literally stated, "I think Thatcher was an absolute fairy godmother. What a joy." Wait a second, an anarchist punk rocker calling a conservative prime minister a fairy godmother? No way, right? This completely shatters that established anti-Thatcher myth, and it kind of hints at a much more complex, almost symbiotic reality operating right beneath the surface. Section 1, the anti-Thatcher indie myth. Let's impartially explore this fascinating cultural relationship between 80s music and politics. And real quick, it's absolutely crucial to note that our entire analysis today is grounded in rigorous academic source material. We're drawing heavily from Mark Alexander Bailey's PhD thesis from the University of Glasgow, which meticulously dissects the relationship between Thatcherism and independent popular music recording in the UK. So we aren't just throwing theories around here, we're looking at documented historical, cultural, and economic data. The irony of this whole era really starts right at the top. While massive musical movements like Rock Against Racism and Red Wedge were actively, loudly organizing against Thatcher's policies, the attention wasn't exactly mutual. Take a look at these actual 1985 briefing notes prepared for Margaret Thatcher before a magazine interview. She received these incredibly basic, honestly kind of detached summaries defining the whole punk era simply as a strange bunch of anti-establishment acts. So that intense, deeply felt political opposition from the music scene, it barely even registered in the government's day-to-day operations. Moving right along to Section 2, the entrepreneurial paradox. This is where we uncover the hidden alignment between the rebels and the government. Because beyond those loud public protests, there was actually a hidden structural alignment between the rebellious indie scene and the government's economic policies. On one side, we have the core indie ideals, collectivism, anti-corporate sentiment, doing things yourself, completely outside the mainstream system. But then, on the other side, look at Thatcherism, economic liberalism, self-reliance, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. Impartially speaking, it is just incredible to see how the indie scene's fierce independence completely mirrored the free market, self-starter ideals championed by the very government they were protesting. They both placed massive value on taking initiative and bypassing those bloated corporate structures. Which leads us to a massive rhetorical question that kind of changes how we view this entire cultural landscape. Could indie record labels actually be regarded as classic Thatcherite entrepreneurship? Think about it. Were the most rebellious anti-establishment voices of the 1980s inadvertently the ultimate capitalists? Well, the historical evidence actually says yes. And honestly, it gets even more ironic. One of the flagship conservative policies of the era was the Enterprise Allowance Scheme. This was designed specifically to create an enterprise culture by throwing financial support behind small business startups. And guess who utilized this government scheme? The founders of iconic, notoriously rebellious independent record labels like Creation, Earache, and Warp Records. So the very government the indie scene was protesting was literally the financial launchpad for their businesses. How wild is that? All right, let's jump to Section 3, distribution as power. Now, to truly act as successful entrepreneurs, these labels had to figure out how to overcome the corporate giants. The defining feature of the independent sector wasn't just a unique, gritty sound, it was actively challenging major label dominance. Breaking away from corporate giants meant building entirely rival distribution networks from scratch. We're talking companies like the Cartel, Pinnacle, and Spartan stepping up. This proved that independence was just as much an industrial supply chain as it was an ideology. Getting the physical records out of the studio and into the shops was the real behind-the-scenes battleground. And this brilliantly illustrates the tension that really started brewing within the indie sector itself. Steve Mason, who took over the independent distributor Pinnacle, noted the guy who walks in with 500 singles in a carrier bag could find things rather difficult. He was actively pushing for the indie scene to get more professional. So you had this direct clash happening between the amateur, do-it-yourself ethos of punk and the very real mainstream corporate ambition required to successfully distribute records on a national scale. Section 4, the ultimate indie paradox. Let's look at a quick micro-narrative case study here. This perfectly proves just how blurry the lines between indie credibility and commercial success actually became in practice. Meet Renee and Renato and their 1982 song, Save Your Love. Now, this was a highly theatrical operatic novelty record released on a tiny husband and wife label called Hollywood Records out of London. Yet, against all odds, this highly unusual song made history. By utilizing those independent networks we just talked about, it became the music industry's very first fully indie-distributed #1 hit. It was a real game changer that altered the independent landscape forever. 980,000. That is the massive number of copies this single novelty record sold, and it held the #1 spot in the charts for 4 consecutive weeks. To put that into perspective, it proved undeniably that independent networks, when properly organized, could commercially match the major corporate labels at their own game. They just didn't need the giants anymore. So the crucial point is what this actually meant for the very definition of the word indie. Ian McNay, an independent label founder, said this about the song. "That's not indie sounding, is it? Pete Waterman had independent ethics, he went off and made it happen." It's incredible, right? A cheesy, operatic novelty record perfectly embodied the entrepreneurial indie ethic because it was self-starting and independently distributed. It wasn't about having a cool sound, it was strictly about the business structure of independence. Let's move to and see how this builds into our final takeaway. Section 5, the true meaning of indie. You see, over the course of the 1980s, the word indie completely mutated. It evolved from describing a fiercely independent business structure, a corporate alternative totally focused on independent distribution networks, into a musical genre and a fashion subculture defined by jangling guitars. Basically, the whole shebang changed. The definition shifted from how the music was sold to how the music sounded. Which leaves us with this final striking paradox. If the anti-capitalist, fiercely independent record labels of the 1980s were actually thriving, self-reliant capitalist startups, who were the real champions of the 1980s free market? Was it the politicians in suits or the punks pressing their own records? It's a fascinating piece of history that completely changes how we view and listen to the era. Well, thanks for joining me on this explainer. I hope you found it as fascinating as I did. Keep questioning the narrative and keep learning.